That's right, we didn't actually forget about this series. We're just, I guess, busy adults with adult things to do now. Anyway, I'm Connor, and today we're talking about the new God of War. Now, if you're not familiar with the PlayStation exclusive series, the original God of War was released for the PS2 back in 2005, and followed the main character of Kratos in his quest to find revenge on Ares, the current God of War. The game saw 2 sequels, a prequel, and several side story games. Subsequent games in the series fleshed out Kratos' story further and saw his ire grow to include the entirety of the Greek pantheon. The series as a whole is well known for its heavy use of action, intricate puzzles, quick-time events, dynamic cinematics, and lots of blood and gore. The newest addition to the series is in many ways both a sequel and something of a reboot, shifting from Greek mythology to that of Norse, perhaps explaining why this new entry is simply called God of War, ditching the number 4. The new game follows an older, now bearded, but no less grouchy Kratos, and his son Atreus, immediately following the death of Kratos' second wife and Atreus' mother, Faye. The two set out to fulfill Faye's final wish of having her ashes spread from the highest peak of the 9 realms. Although Kratos has seemingly hidden his gruesome past for many years, it's immediately obvious that his presence in Midgard has finally caught the attention of some very powerful forces. Kratos and Atreus soon find themselves facing off with Asgardians such as Baldur and his nephews Modi and Magni, as well as a plethora of monstrous creatures from Norse mythology. So, what do we think of this latest installment? Well, let's start with the good, and our first point. God of War grows up. So back in 2005, when the original God of War came out, I was 16, and to a 16-year-old male, this game was the shit. Unmitigated violence, buckets of blood, gore, a protagonist filled with all the goddamn angst in the world, and lots of boobies. I would not be surprised to learn that the initial pitch at Santa Monica Studios was, let's just have a guy who, kills everything. It's understandable why the series has kind of a reputation of being a little bro-ish, despite its extensive use of mythology, lore, and its sophisticated puzzles. While all that is still fun and entertaining, now that I'm pushing 30, insert long groan here, I naturally look for entertainment that can propagate some loftier and more sophisticated ideas. And to Santa Monica Studios' credit, I feel they recognize not only that the original fans have aged in the last 8 years since we've seen Kratos, but also recognize that the landscape of the industry has changed significantly, with a much more diverse player base and a strong shift to better storytelling. This God of War is the series grown up, focusing much more on story and character than on spectacle. It deals with emotional topics like parenthood, loss, love, rectifying with one's past, even a little dash of post-traumatic stress. It overall just makes the game seem less sophomoric. It's really fantastic to progress through the game and see Atreus develop into a much more capable fighter, but even better to see his relationship with Kratos grow and become more open and trusting. Even death is used to greater effect. It has meaning and significance. Murdering things has a weight and significance the earlier games willfully ignored. This is truly where the new God of War shines. Next on the good is the combat mechanics and customization. One of the early things you recognize in this game, if you're familiar with the others in the series, is that the combat system has been dramatically overhauled. The original series was definitely something of a hack and slash, with little sophistication in Kratos' moveset, with his trademark Blades of Chaos able to dominate a sea of enemies with relative ease. That's changed a bit with the 2018 installment. Armed primarily with a new weapon, the Leviathan Axe, for the first half of the game, you are immediately forced into playing a much less gung-ho playstyle. And part of this is also due to the enemies in the game being much more challenging and having more sophisticated movesets themselves. Even in the second half of the game, when you get an additional weapon, the enemy design forces you to be much more strategic than in previous installments. In addition, some of the boss fights in the game require you to be keeping up with your customizations. You will need to change or upgrade your axe pommel, scour Midgard for better runes and armor. You have to make good use of and manage your rune abilities effectively. You also have to make good use of Atreus, as you will need to direct him to attack in order to distract an enemy, or to stop an attack coming from above. As a result of all of this, the learning curve to combat is much steeper. However, it's very satisfying once you've managed it. The combat and the new customization adds a depth that was severely lacking in the series. The overhauled mechanic system has had the effect of making the game much more challenging, forcing you to be much more careful with your movements. It's kind of like a Dark Souls Light, which I find to be more of a positive overall. Next on the list of the good, less reliance on QuickTime events. Ah yes, QuickTime events. There was a time in the mid-2000s when they were all the rage, due largely in part to God of War. While they are certainly dynamic and good for suspense and a quick adrenaline hit, they were immersion-breaking. Players became too highly focused on trying to anticipate when they would appear, because nothing is fucking worse than dying because you were a millisecond too slow on hitting a single button. This God of War reserves QuickTime solely for finishers on wounded enemies and lifting heavy things, and is ultimately better for it. Next on the good, the graphics. As you would expect from a Sony flagship title, this game is fantastic to look at. The environments are rich in color and have tremendous detail. This is easily one of the best looking games for the current generation of systems. I would definitely suggest playing with the game's photo mode to take in the splendor that is this version of Midgard. Those things being said, I certainly didn't think God of War was perfect, so here are the bad things in the game. First up, the fucking menu text. Now, since the game came out, this issue has been mitigated somewhat in patches, but since solving it completely requires a UI overhaul, it's not going to be completely solved. The menu text is fucking tiny and hard to read. So, I have a 52-inch TV that I only sit maybe 6 feet from. I should not be having this problem. And it's especially disappointing because a lot of the lore and mythos of the game comes via journal entries. It instantly reminded me of the original Dead Rising, where the text was just fucking impossible to read. I will give Santa Monica a kudos for responding quickly to complaints and making the text larger in the first week, but it's a design flaw that really leaves you asking questions. Next up, Atreus can be really fucking annoying. Video game companions, am I right? While Atreus brings out the best in Kratos from a story perspective, and their dialogue can be quite charming at points, when you're exploring through the realms, he can be downright frustrating. At points you'll come across areas that will have buckets suspended by ropes. You can cut these down to gain some hack silver, which is the currency to buy or upgrade equipment. Atreus is clearly programmed on a location basis to call your attention to it with a, hey, what's this, or look at that. Two problems with this. One, you're not usually looking at him, so it's sometimes annoying to decipher what he's calling your attention to. And two, sometimes these prompts persist even after you've found the fucking thing, which makes backtracking through areas really terrible. But the worst fucking thing is when you've been in an area for a while and he'll say,
I don't know what we're still doing here.
You know what we're still doing here, you little fucking brat? Trying to solve this fucking puzzle to open this chest, so shut the fuck up already. It happens way, way too often. There's even a specific realm that is very grindy and demands a large amount of time as you wait for openings and traps. And he says it over and over again. I never had such a strong urge to strangle a fictitious child before. Next up, the goddamn boat and time sinks. I hate this fucking boat. It's hard to steer, and you spend so much goddamn time in it. The main hub of the game is the Lake of Nine, which requires a lot of exploration, which in turn requires a lot of time in this ill-conceived boat. It's slow, it's tedious, it's repetitive. It's also immersion-breaking, because when you're on land and approach a dock, a boat will be there, even if it's not where you docked previously. Now, mechanically, it would be admittedly worse if the boat didn't magically appear when and where you needed it, but I would argue that the whole setup is fundamentally flawed. It's one of the many things in the game, like the slow opening of chests or doors, or the numerous and painfully slow moving lifts, that just chew up time and make the game feel dragged out. Next point, the realms are too small and confined. Now, I agree not every game has to be open world, and as we saw with Dynasty Warriors 9, making a game open world is not always the correct choice. However, I think God of War is definitely a game that would have benefited. It's immediately jarring for a game like this to be funneling you into tight, narrow paths. It's hard to get used to the fact that rocks that look climbable are not, and I can understand narrow paths and dungeons in temples, but not so much in the wilds of Midgard. The opening area feels tremendously claustrophobic as a result. And even when you get to the Lake of Nine, you realize that this open area is 90% water. It just feels off in this day and age with a AAA title like this. And it made the world feel less detailed and less alive. For a game that tries to separate itself from its predecessors, I feel like a real dedication to being less linear would have gone a long way. Last up, unanswered questions. Now, if you're familiar with the games, or even if you were paying attention to my opening description of the series, you know God of War comes to the table with a lot of questions. The last we see Kratos in God of War 3, things aren't looking good for him, certainly not for the Greek pantheon, nor for the inhabitants of his entire world. So the big elephant in the room, of course, is how and why are we here in Midgard? Kratos' past also seems to be of high interest to the Asgardians he meets, so what gives? Well, slight spoilers here, this game is uninterested in answering that question. There's the tiniest of tiny clues that Kratos' former worlds, the Norse realms, and a handful of others may be connected in some mysterious way. But that's all we get. The game also seems uninterested in answering questions about Kratos' second wife, mother of Atreus. As a matter of fact, the game seems very interested in raising more questions and determined not to answer any of them. While this is clearly done because a sequel is undoubtedly in the distant horizon, perhaps it makes a little bit of sense story-wise since Kratos is unwilling and uncomfortable in talking about his past, it still leaves the player very unsatisfied. So with all that being said, there is nothing left but to give God of War a score. Now, I was not as smitten with the game as a lot of other reviews I've seen, due to the flaws discussed, so therefore I am giving God of War an 8 out of 10. The game was good, certainly cinematically very impressive, graphics were good, mechanically it's a huge improvement, but there are some real flaws. The two biggest things were not making Midgard feel grand and alive, and saving a lot of story for sequels. So that's our review. Feel free to leave your opinions in the comments below, along with suggestions for other games we should review. And if you like this video, do the things that don't really matter because YouTube is broken. Bye.